Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. If you're joining us from beautiful, sunny fall Montreal, if you're joining us as our guests this evening are from different parts of the Middle East, Yulie is joining us from Israel, Tel Aviv. Sagi and Udi are joining us from London, if I'm not mistaken. So a good evening and a good late afternoon to you. My name is Csaba Nikolenyi. I'm professor of political science and also director of the Azrieli Institute of Israel Studies at Concordia University. This is a very special year for us at the Institute as we are celebrating 1 decade, 10 years that we have already been engaging our university community, but also the community at large in intellectually challenging discussions and conversations about Israel, which is our passion. And fitting this very exciting year, we are able to bring to the screen, unfortunately, but this certainly doesn't take away from the excitement of the event, a very special group of friends who have treated us to a very special film with a very challenging, but therefore intellectually exciting content. And of course, I mean our guests, director Yulie Cohen and producers Udi Nir and Sagi Bornstein, whose recent collaboration brought to us Our Natural Right, a documentary about where Israel has come since the Declaration of Independence was signed now over 70 years ago. Friends, before I would open up the conversation, and of course the film was made available to our members and registered participants yesterday for viewing, and we had a phenomenal level of interest, which was just wonderful. I was delighted to see how many people wanted to see the film. And I was also very excited to read some of the comments that I have received, and some of which I will be able to share with our guests later on today. It was just a very, very strong interaction and engagement. But before we would start the conversation, please allow me to share a few words of introduction about our guests. And it is a challenge to do that because our guests are so very accomplished. Yulie Cohen, as I mentioned, is the director of the film. Yulie studied literature and international relations at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Before switching universities and fields also, she moved on to study sociology and anthropology at Tel Aviv University. But I guess these fields were not the ultimate passion. Eventually, Yulie joined the film industry, having spent some time and also learning parts of the art in the United States. She became an independent filmmaker eventually in 1993. Among the many kudos, the many accomplishments, and the very, very rich filmography, to Yulie's credit, I would just like to mention one which can be considered a highlight, certainly not the highlight, just one of the many highlights. And this is, of course, the trilogy that started with My Terrorist, My Land, Zion, Zion Admati, and ended with My Brother. In addition to being a filmmaker, Yulie is also busy nurturing and training the next generation of filmmakers. If the information that I found about you, Yulie, is correct, you're still teaching at Bezalel, where last year you were decorated with the prestigious award for excellence in teaching. So you're making films, but you're also making the future filmmakers of the Israeli film industry, which is just wonderful. Udi Nir should not need an introduction to our screen and to our community because he was our guest last year after we had the post-film discussion following the film about Golda Meir, former Prime Minister Golda Meir. Udi is a writer, a director, and producer. His first feature documentary was #Uploading Holocaust, which was made and was released in 2016, followed by Golda, which we showed last year. Udi studied at the School of Playwriting in Tel Aviv. He created and directed theater shows and also worked as a producer at Klippa Theater. Before turning to arts, Udi had also worked for Amnesty International and other human rights non-governmental organizations. Sagi Bornstein has 15 years of experience under his belt as a director, producer, and editor of documentaries, reality and news. Working together, collaborating with Udi, his works include Golda, released in 2019, also #Uploading Holocaust, and also Kafka's Last Story, that was released in 2011. Sagi studied photography at Camera Obscure Film School and worked for leading Israeli broadcasters before starting his own production company. So with these short, very abbreviated introductions, Yulie, Udi, and Sagi, a very warm and special welcome. So I would like to start this conversation, if I may, by asking you to tell us about the genesis of the film. And if I may ask you to tell us about the origin of the idea in a personal way. You all have very rich personal Korot Chaim, CVs, resumes. Yulie, you're a very accomplished filmmaker. You have made all kinds of different films before. And I do want to mention that I found it very interesting how, after making a very personal trilogy, My Terrorist, My Brother, My Land, Tion, now you're making a movie about a collective movie about our natural right. So is Yulie changing? Is this a new Yulie Cohen we are about to embrace and see? I would love to hear. And Sagi and Udi, are you charting new directions with this film? So tell us the factual, but also the personal story, the origin of our natural right.
Maybe I'll start from the beginning and then I'll shift it over to you, Yulie. This project started a couple of years ago when we were actually making the Golda film. Some of you might have seen it. And while making the Golda film, we came across Gideon Meir, Golda's grandson, who, as you might have seen now, is also interviewed in this film. And this whole idea of our natural rights started from the encounter with him, because when we got to know him, and he's quite a colorful person, and his views were very interesting to us. It was interesting to see how he views Israel today in light of his family history. And we started to wonder who are the grandchildren of those 30 plus founding fathers and two mothers of modern Israel. What do they think about this place? What kind of a mirror are they for contemporary Israeli society? And what can we learn from how they view the complicated situation we live in? And I think very early on in the process, we didn't really know a lot. Very early on, we got a commission from Keshet, the broadcaster of the film, who liked the principal idea and basically wanted a film about, it was just about, it was towards the 70th anniversary of Israel. So they were looking for a film to celebrate the 70th anniversary, and they basically asked us for a film about the Declaration of Independence. And I think that, especially for us, I'm talking about myself, but probably also about Sagi here, although it was very interesting for us, we also felt, or I at least also felt quite distant from this document. It's something I studied about in school, but I never really read in detail. I don't think I've ever sat down in my entire life to read that entire text. Maybe it happened in school, but you don't remember these things. And I realized that I never really looked into this document, and I don't actually know what I feel about it. And if I do feel something about it, it's quite estranged. It's not something I identify with or I look up to. But on the other hand, I constantly find myself and others and people on the news, day in, day out, quoting it as part of political arguments, or when a new law comes in the Knesset, or it is something we keep going back to, but I realized I don't actually know anything about it. And then we knew Yulie, Sagi knew Yulie for a lot of years, and I knew her as well. And we wanted to team up and make a film together. And I remember our first meeting with you, Yulie, when you told us about the Declaration of Independence that was hanged. I'll let you tell that in a moment, but in more detail. But that you had it in your house on the wall for a lot of years. And I think that right there it became clear that there's a quite almost a generational gap between us, and definitely a gap in how we grew up and how we perceive this place. And I think that's exactly what fascinated us. We wanted to create a sort of dialogue between us and understand this document in a new light. But I'll let you tell a little bit more, Udi, about your side of things.
Thank you, Udi. Yulie, please unmute yourself. That's great.
So I was happy to work with Udi and Sagi on this subject, and there was no doubt that it's not a personal journey. It's about the foundation of the state of Israel, and so it's not that I made all my films personal. I made others, although I have a passion, a real passion to personal films. So we discussed together how do we want to approach the film and how to tell the story. And we thought that the grandchildren would be a good idea, and to go into the building where it was originally declared also was part of the idea. And then we found these groups that are coming there every day or every other day. So then later we worked on the questionnaire that I was going to ask our characters, the great grandchildren of the people who signed the declaration, and then Sagi is a great editor. We worked together on editing the material. And the final present we received from this project is that the building went into renovation, as one can see at the end. So it brought us kind of a gift as documentary filmmakers to end the film with this metaphorically images of maybe this is what the state of Israel should do also about its declaration. It should be renovated also. Yeah.
Fascinating. Thank you, Yulie. Sagi, would you like to add anything from your perspective?
No.
No, okay.
They just done it really well. But yeah, we really liked working with Yulie on this film, because it was much needed for us to have a lot of perspective, because we cannot deal with this topic alone. It's a huge subject in Israel society, and it was much needed for us to have a lot of perspective on this topic. And Yulie was a great team member, and we are happy that we were able to make this film together.
So Sagi, let me not let you off the hook, so to speak, so quickly. And I would like to then pick up on something that Udi mentioned, and that was the distance that Udi, that is, and his generation, and I guess I can include you in that sentiment also, felt in terms of being just too removed from the document, from the text. And Udi, you alluded to the fact that Yulie, on the other hand, at some point even had a copy of the document in the family home. So that's interesting. If you could open that up a bit, that would be fantastic. But what I would like to ask you now is, having made the film and know that, having dealt with the reactions, the reception, having listened over and over again to what the grandchildren had to say, what's your connection with the document now? Has it changed? Has it moved? Has it become any more intimate?
It has changed for me. It's a little bit more intimate, perhaps, but I think it's sort of a movement in two different directions. On the one hand, I think that I was able to actually, I would say it like this: looking at the document itself maybe pushed me even further away from it. But looking at the context in which it was drafted, looking at the stories, and this is something I have to say Yulie insisted on. I was not sure of the value of it when we started to go into editing, for example, but really insisted on bringing the personal stories, the background of the people who signed the declaration, the world in which they were living, the views that they had, the war that they had just came out of, or whatever it is they were fearing or was in their minds. And I think I somehow grew closer to the people. I understood their circumstances better. I understood where, in a way, where they came from, but not only physically, but in terms of, what kind of world they grew up in and how that dictates, what you might put in a document when you now establish a state, which is very different from what I might have wanted to do, but I live in a completely different world. And I grew up into this country, into a situation of being a Jewish majority and not experiencing any discrimination or anti-Semitism or all these things. So I think I somehow grew closer to them and understood them better. On the other hand, I was also surprised with many things that I think this document is lacking with. The biggest one that I can maybe point out is, and I think it was a shock actually for all of us, but growing up in Israel, you always get this constant phrase of Jewish and democratic. There's always this battle between being Jewish and being democratic, and both values or both things are sort of always put up in an equal level by your teachers, by your parents, it's something you always hear together: Jewish and democratic, Jewish and democratic. And of course it's a battle because there are contradictions between those two things sometimes when you sort of nail it down to reality and you have to make laws out of it. But as a value, they're both there. And I was absolutely sure, as I said, I didn't really know the document, but I was absolutely sure that this definition of Jewish and democratic comes right from the start. It comes from the Declaration of Independence. And I remember a certain moment when we were talking about this topic, and all of a sudden we said, okay, let's find the quote within the declaration that says Jewish and democratic, and we started reading through it and we couldn't find democratic. It says Jewish state, but it doesn't say democratic in any place. And nowhere in the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel does it say that it has to be a democratic state. There are values of equality and other issues that are mentioned there, but this huge ethos in Israeli society, in the Israeli psyche of Jewish and democratic, was born later. Democratic was just not such an issue back then when they just established the state. So it's things like that I think in some cases I even grew in a way less fond of the document, or I see more flaws in it than I see before. But I also understand the people who drafted it better, and I understand better why these flaws are there and what were the intentions behind that.
Thank you, Udi. Thank you for that personal reflection. That's very, very informative. Yulie, what about you, the director? How has your relationship with the document changed, if at all?
Well, so I really admired the declaration for many years without really looking into it deeply until we did what we did together. Because there are some very nice values in it, which I grew up on. But while making the film, I realized that what I see the most problematic issue in the declaration is the fact that it is a Jewish state, and we can't ignore anymore the fact that when you establish a state based on religion, you become racist, because then whoever is not Jewish is second best citizen. And this was really very unfortunate to understand, to realize, and not to be able to ignore, to avoid or to ignore anymore. Of course, that if Israel could have made a real legislation, chukah, long ago, maybe this racism wouldn't be developed so badly. But I'm living in Jaffa for the last 10 years. I'm living with Arab neighbors, and it's really very obvious to see that we are not the same citizens, not the same level of citizens in the state of Israel. So this is something I found out while doing this film, and it's really bothers me, and I hope one day it will change. This last government that we have for the first time, we have Arab party in the coalition. It makes me more optimistic that things will improve.
Thank you, Yulie. Thank you very much for that. So this is fascinating because when you watch the film, you see very different conclusions. You offer in the film a rich diversity of how the grandchildren come to view this and come to answer this particular question. You have Professor Kathnelson from the Hebrew University, who in no uncertain terms shares the sentiment you have just shared with us, Yulie, but in an even more radical language. And then we have Nitzan Kahana. And I'm picking on them because they are also two female speakers. So that's interesting. And there are others in between. So what does this diversity, how do you cope with this diversity? How do you handle this diversity? Because you obviously, as you have just revealed it to us so honestly, you have your own personal relationship with this problem. But because of the honest and wonderful filmmaker and producer that you are, you don't impose this on the film. You allow the subject and the film to speak for themselves so that we could be influenced by that diversity that's there. So how do you negotiate? How do you dialogue with this diversity?
Well, for me, it's very easy because I make films. I'm looking for truth. I don't do propaganda films, and I don't do films for my agenda. I do films that, for me, they're trying to reveal kind of a truth. And what our natural right reveals is exactly the opinions that are in the Israeli society nowadays. So it does represent the reality here. It doesn't have to represent me or Udi or Sagi. It has to represent the people.
Udi or Sagi? Thank you, Yulie. And
yeah, I agree completely with Yulie. I think, I mean, generally speaking, it's always almost even risky to, even if you do decide to, push in a way your own agenda, it doesn't necessarily mean that the audience will either accept it or even understand it in the same way that you thought they will, or there's anyways a lot of room for interpretation. And I think our job is always to sort of bring up the questions and not give the answers. It's way more effective to open a question than to give the answer in a film, in my eyes. And so I think we were insistent on that. We, of course, there is a lot of room for influence when you ask the questions, because the kind of questions you ask will influence the discourse and the kind of answers that could come. But still, our job is to ask the questions. And I think that right from the get-go, it was clear to us also in a way on a dramatic level, because the film also has to work, in terms of drama or content, video content, not just in terms of the topic. And it was clear that this kind of argument between, it's not even two sides, as you said, it's a very wide spectrum of opinions on each of the topics. This kind of argument and confrontation between the different views is the most interesting thing that we saw in the materials. And it resonates what we are experiencing here. The issue is, and I think this is part of what the film comes to show or to say, is that part of one of our biggest problems, I think, is that this document or any other document that could have been drafted after it never answered, or at least gave some common ground to the biggest questions that define our life here. And we've never written a constitution, not in the American way of a constitution and not in the British way of an unwritten constitution. We've done neither of those. We have a little bit of what's called ground rules or basic rules, which are, you know, above the normal laws and do a little bit of order in our society, but they're always they're quite easily changed if you want to, and they're very unextensive. They don't really answer most of the big questions. So we really are left with a lot of open questions about who we are as a country and as a society, and what values we put up front, and how we govern ourselves. So I think we basically, more than anything, we wanted to bring up those topics and show that we believe that they should be answered. And through that, we can see a lot of interesting things. So as you said, I think the fact that some of the grandchildren of the people who established this place would like, and they say it out loud, Nurit Katzenelson, but also others, also Golda's grandson, say out loud, and Golda wasn't considered a very, you know, a big lefty. She was quite on the right side of the political map in Israel. The fact that her grandson and other grandchildren say that they would like to see an Arab president or prime minister, that it's time for us to be more inclusive and to not be strictly a Jewish state run by Jews only, but to open that to all the people who live here. That is quite radical. And on the other hand, it's also fascinating to hear people who, you know, bluntly say that these jobs are reserved for Jews, which is not even the position of official Israel, because official Israel says anybody with a citizenship can become prime minister. But it's clear to some of these grandchildren that's not a possibility and shouldn't be a possibility. And I think that in between that range is a discussion that Israeli society and perhaps the Jewry of the world as well needs to have urgently, because it dictates a lot of what happens here.
Thank you, Udi. Thank you. Let me ask our guest about the title of the film. The title of the film is a quote borrowed from the very document that we are dealing with, the Declaration of Independence. Why these words? Had you chosen some? Clearly, these were not the words, Udi, as you told us a few minutes ago, you were looking for. You were looking for something that would capture the Jewish and democratic, Bedibur Echad, as President Livni used to say often in the document. This is not what you were looking for. You were not looking for an expression of our natural right to the land, to political sovereignty, however you want to frame it. Why did you end up choosing these words from the Declaration, and why do you think that this frames the film and what you wanted the film to articulate, and the message that it would convey better than some other expression or phrase? Or just tell us how it happened. Was it Yulie's choice? Was it Sagi's? Was it Udi's? Or was it really a Jewish and democratic debate that gave rise to it?
I have to say, Yulie, maybe you remember. I have to say, I don't quite remember what was the moment we chose the film. I remember that I remember that we were playing with it, and we were playing with natural right and our natural right, and we tried other quotes. It was clear to us that it will be a quote, I think, right, Yulie, very early on. We want to put the document up there as much as we can, and we want a quote. But I think the reason I liked it at the end was because, I mean, it might sound almost idiotic, but I really like play of words. I like double meaning, especially in film names. I like when a film's title implies to more than one thing, because I think it opens the door for the audience to interpret the film in different ways, which I think is a good thing. And I think our natural right implied two different things for me. One, it could have almost been with a question mark at the end, you know, but it asks questions about, or it raises the question about our right to be here, which is always, I mean, in every major political debate, if you go deep enough, you will always, in Israel, you will always get to that issue. Is it a God-given right? But if we are secular and we don't believe in God, as most of the people who established the country was, then you know, someone once told us that I think it was Uri Avneri during Golda. He told us that the weirdest thing about Zionism was that the premise was God doesn't exist, but he gave us the land of Israel. Because they were secular, but they also used this God-given right as a justification. So I think it opens up to that question of what are the origins of, or what are the justifications for our being here? How do we explain it to ourselves, to the world? Which is always an interesting question. And then the other one, of course, it implies to the grandchildren. You know, it's their natural, in a way, right to speak. I think that, you know, having someone, even a very prominent researcher in Israel, saying that they want to have an Arab president, or that they would not allow, you know, the situation of an Arab president, is not a big deal. But when it's the grandchildren of the people who established this place, who, you know, the 30-something people who actually did the move of making this into a country, with all the risks and with all the possibilities that brought, then it gets a different validity in a way. People listen to it in a different way, and I think it has to do with their, you know, basically with their natural right, with their family. It's almost like in a way royalty, or you know, it's their it's the legacy that they carry with them.
Thank you, Udi. Sagi, Yulie, would you like to add?
Yeah, I can add that it raised some questions like, what are the rights? Like, if they have any rights. You should mute.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Because it's not such a normal thing, like, for those people. I don't know if they have rights more than other people in Israel to speak. I think that they have rights like any other people, citizen of Israel, or people who lives in Israel. But it was like a study case that we wanted to make a checkup after 70 years, or, you know, but I don't think, like, me personally, that they have like extra rights, but it raised the question: do they have those rights to speak in the name of their grandfathers, or do they not? Like, I like this question. I'm not sure that I have an answer, like, if they have a right to speak or not, but they spoke already. So,
but I think just your reactions show the power of the title that you have chosen. I'm learning so much from what you're telling us. That's it's very, very grateful. Yulie, anything from you? Yeah.
I would like to add a few words. First of all, we decided that the text of the declaration will be like a character in the film.
Mm-hmm.
So we really treated the text as a subject through the grandchildren. So the name had to be from the text. Me personally never doubt my natural right, because I'm a 6th generation here. But then when I was looking to live in Jaffa, and I discussed with someone the fact that I'm a 6th generation, and so he said to me, well, I'm 200 generation here. What does it mean, 6th generation? So he was Arab. So I never had doubts about my right to be here, because really my parents were born here, and my grandparents were born in, grandparents, so I feel really deep rooted here. But I really liked the way Nurit Peled El-Hanan was talking about our natural right, and the way she talks about it with criticism, and the fact that my parents took part of establishing a state based on the Bible, but then they were so secular, so how come the Bible was so important? So there are really many, many issues and topics which are part of this story. Anyway.
Yulie, why was it important for you to show the groups and to show the guides? And we've seen different guides, and different characters also who work at Independence Hall. Why was it important for us to see them and the interaction, the portrayal, the teaching, if you will, the presentation of the Declaration of Independence in these Taglit, but not just, but also soldier tours? Why?
Well, surprisingly, it was much more interesting than I thought, because at the beginning, all the groups looked like the state of Israel is self-marketing the Zionist story in really narrow point of view. But then there was one. I mute her. Yeah, I did. And there was one group, no, not group. How do you say Madrid? Leader? No.
Guide.
Guide. There was one guy whom I liked, which did show the complex situation in 48, in 14 of May 48, that the Jews were singing in the streets and dancing while the Arabs were very sad. And so it was really an interesting way of looking at the history and the context of this afternoon, Friday, 14th of May, 1948, how we reach this point here in Tel Aviv. So we really liked this scenes. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Udi, please.
No, I can add. I think that seeing official guidance in places of historical significance, for me at least, is always fascinating. It could be in the United States, and it could be in London, and it could be in Israel. It could be anywhere. But when the state or a state frames or narrates its own history, outlines its own narrative, both to its own citizens and especially to people from the outside, I think it's always fascinating to look at, because you get a small capsule of what the story is, or what the story, what the state would like the story to be. And as Yulie said, it was interesting to see that it's quite diverse, that one guide talking to an international group will say one thing, and another guy talking to a group of Israeli soldiers will say a slightly different thing. Sometimes there'll be more complexity, sometimes it will be more superficial, but it was just fascinating to see. And also just to keep in mind that this project was in a way site-specific. Everything was shot in one room. And of course, we made the choice to bring the grandchildren there and make a set out of it, but in normal time, in its day-to-day, you know, the present time of this space, in the same way that we looked at the present time of these families or these people who established the country, we also wanted to look at the present time of this very specific and symbolic location. And this is what happens there. This is how, you know, each day looks in there. And as Yulie mentioned, we were lucky enough to even have the renovation at the end as a sort of brilliant imagery to end the film with, because that's what happens there these days.
Let me just give a quick indication to our audience that I would like to ask you another 3 questions, and then I would like to turn the screen or the chat box, if you will, over to our friends who are waiting so patiently for the opportunity to bombard you with their own questions and insights. So this is now a good time, ladies and gentlemen, to start putting in your questions and comments if you so choose. Udi, I would like to pick up on the last point that you mentioned, and that is the site specificity of the location and the shooting. You brought the grandchildren to the Hall of Independence, like to the site. What was their reaction to the place? Did you observe that? Was there any difference in how they reacted to being there, which they may know as a very important site of tourism, which is a very important site of public education or civic education, as you said? And could you connect? Were you able to connect their behavior and their relationship with the place with what they then said afterwards in the interviews? Or not at all? They just walked in and they sat down and they said their piece as they would in any studio.
I don't know if there is a direct correlation. It's an interesting question. I never sort of drew the lines to see if I see a direct correlation. So I don't know if I can see that, but there was definitely a big difference in how they react. Generally speaking, in the way we framed it, as far as I remember, we sort of took them directly. Everything was behind the screen, sort of, so they couldn't really see what's going on, and they were, you know, in makeup in another room, and then they were sort of brought into their chair, and we, as soon as we could, we immediately started the interview. I think, Yulie, that one of your first questions in the questionnaire was also about how they feel in this space, or something like that. So it was definitely interesting, and some of their answers, I think, also made it into the film. But generally, I can just say I remember very different reactions. I remember, for example, Nurit Peled and Hanan. I remember her being quite cold towards it, or not extremely moved by the space, or interested in what it represents, or but not very moved from it. And on the contrary, Kagan, the grandson of Rachel Kagan, the one with the dress, you know, he brought his grandmother's dress that has been in the closet for 70 years. Unopened for 70 years. He seemed sort of emotionally ecstatic just from being there, from, you know, having any kind of connection. And I think it has to do with her. I think he was moved because that place represents her for him. And it represents the highest moment in her life, and his greatest sort of family legacy moment. So he was extremely moved by it. And of course, people who tend to identify with Israel in a stronger way, you know, tended to be more soft and emotional towards the place, or more excited about it. And people who tend to disagree with Israel more tended to be more cold towards it, or yeah, Yulie, I think.
I think that the fact that we decided to put on Ben-Gurion voice within this hall, as he was recorded reading the text. So the fact that they had to listen to it, I think, moved them in an emotional way, and it was it enabled them to feel more in this place. So they felt like more like participating in the what happened 70 years earlier with their grandparents. So I think this was really a good idea that we used this. Yeah.
Thank you. Sagi, anything? Oh, that's good.
I might add, you know, I'm usually the bummer one. Like I don't like to agree with everyone most of the time. I just want to mention that it was a place for horses once. Like it was Dizengoff House, and the same place was the horsery. How do you say it? Like the place that they were feeding the horses. So it's just a place. And being here, like in London, we are now with another film here in film festival. We are seeing places for, you know, 1,000, 2,000 years, like established places. And here we are at the beginning of making our myth, or of our mythos, of making this miracle called Israel happen. So it's just a place, and we are putting on it like a lot of meaning, and it's really depend like how do you, what's your personal attitude towards it. And it could be like a horse place, or it could be like the Rosetta Stone of how the Jewish country established. So I don't know. I just thought it was worth mentioning.
Thank you, Sagi.
But in 48, it was a Tel Aviv museum, not a
It wasn't stables anymore. Yeah.
Yeah,
no,
but
it
20 years
started
as
later.
yeah, but no, this is wonderful. Thank you.
I think just one word about that, because I think it's interesting that
Sure.
It was a very strong impression that I had as well, I have to say, in the Independence Hall, because when we first came to do sort of the location tour, before we went into shoot in this place, we went there to see it. And the first time I walked in there, I knew the place from pictures, you know, like the Ben Gurion reading out the text, or a little bit of it. There's like 30 seconds of video or something like that. The rest was lost in true Israeli style. So when I first walked in there, it is such an unassuming, it's not a very impressive space, you know. It's a small sort of side back door gallery. You step 2 steps down, and then you're in this like back room gallery of an old museum kind of. It's nothing you would imagine to be, you know, the grand hall of Israeli independence. It's a very, very modest and sort of utilitarian kind of space, with basic chairs and a basic curtain, and you know, nothing out of the ordinary. So in that respect, I think it sort of still bears some of the legacy of its humble beginning as a horse stable. You know, it wasn't built to accommodate this, you know, grand event and all the meanings that we have given that event over the years. There's something interesting in the tension there.
Thank you. Absolutely. Thank you, Udi. I realize that this question may be difficult or may not be difficult to answer, to relate to. It might be sensitive or it may not be. You will have to be the judge of it. But not everyone, not every family is represented. Why are certain voices missing? Did you have any experiences from any grandchildren who did not want to participate? And if you can't share that, I absolutely understand. But it is my task to provoke you. So whatever you want to share about what's missing, tease us to it.
So we had the grandchild of the rabbi who is included in the film when he says, ברוך אתה אדוני שהחיינו וקיימנו והגיענו לרגע הזה. His grandchild was there. We filmed him, we interviewed him, but he didn't get into the film just because of trying to make a good film, not because nothing else. And this makes me really sad, because I would have liked to see a Haredi Jewish Israeli in the film, but it didn't work. On the other hand, we tried to bring one of the grandchildren of, what's the name of the Communist Party?
I forgot his name as well already, but the Vilner, Meir Vilner from the Israeli Communist Party.
Yeah, and nobody agreed. So we were very sorry, because we really wanted to hear also a different voice. What else? I mean, this is the two examples that I can.
Yeah, I think these are the two. The two. I think it's the only two parties who are not represented, basically. Or I mean, one of them actually comes from a party that was eventually represented. But, yeah, but I would say these are the two main voices that we weren't able to bring in. One, as Yulie said, it was just. I mean, it's basically editing considerations. You know, sometimes an interviewee just doesn't say anything interesting. It happens, not because it's controversial, not because we don't agree with him, not just because he doesn't, you know, he speaks very slowly and he avoids giving any kind of answer that has any kind of meat. You know, it's this kind of parve answer, not here, not there. So, and sometimes when that happens and you only have 46 minutes and you do have we have over 10 interviewees in 46 minutes, you can do the math with a bit of context. It doesn't leave a lot of room for people to speak. We knew that we couldn't have all 30 something. We had to narrow it down to about a third of that. And we tried to keep it as balanced as we could in terms of views and how they react to modern day Israel, but also in terms of their background and the political background of their grandparents. So I would say, we stand behind it. It's quite well balanced. It's missing a Haredi Jew. That's we were also sorry about that, but it just didn't. We tried it so many times, but it just didn't work. And it's missing a representative of the Communist Party because they were the only ones who refused. There are some, of course, who don't have grandchildren or whose grandchildren don't live in Israel and so on. But they were the only the only family that refused, that didn't want to sort of be represented in the film.
Thank you for sharing that. That's remarkable. My last question, and then I will turn it over to the audience, is about the reception of the film. What can you tell us about the national and the international reactions that you have received? Where have you shown the film so far? Festivals, schools, perhaps the staff in Tel Aviv, Independence Hall. And what has been the reaction? What are the attitudes? Do you get the sense that people have understood the message you wanted to convey? Do you get the sense that you're misunderstood, or neither?
From the screenings that I had, I participated in, it raised a good conversation, and this is what I want to achieve by making films, because it provokes their thoughts and thinking, and so there were some good conversations after the screenings, and it was transmitted in Israel in one of the major channels. So actually, I never heard about the rating, but it is still available online, I think. So people see it, but I don't know how many. Do you know, Udi?
Not yet. We need to get the rating statistics actually, but good question. But no, I mean, I agree. So also, this film came out. We didn't plan for it to be like that, but a lot of things happened, and the film came out right at the middle of the pandemic, the first wave of the pandemic in Israel. And it came out in a very nice festival that usually takes place in Tel Aviv Cinematheque, but it then had to take place online. So again, people watched it, but we were not, in a way, there in the room to feel the audience like we many times are with festival screenings. And the same goes for other festivals so far. So we've been quite sort of distant from it due to the circumstances. And the same goes, of course, for TV. When it's on TV, you know that a lot of people see it, but it's hard to know what the reactions are. I would say I was both. So after this first screening in the online screening in Tel Aviv, there was an event I found to be fascinating at the time. It was usually an event about a film, even if it's a film you were involved in the making of, is, you know, many times it's not very provoking for you because you've dealt with the question. But I would say that all of the events I've attended so far, both the first one and we had another one in Tel Aviv, a physical screening, and sort of open air screening. In all of these screenings, I was quite surprised by how provoking the film was. For everybody, no matter their views, and no matter, some people, you know, were angry about this, and some people were angry about that, or some people liked this or loved that, but everybody wanted to talk. In a way, you got the sense that, you know, people were, there's a need to continue the conversation after the film ends. And I agree with Yulie, that's always a very good, or like something that I'm very happy about. And also I have to say in Tel Aviv, in the second screening, I was surprised by the fact that there were a lot of young people in the audience. And they were taking a very active part in the debate. I think that it was surprising to see that, you know, this topic of the Declaration of Independence, or going back to our origins, or the beginning of our thinking, of our being here in Israel, is not something that's reserved for, you know, whoever lived through that or is closer to that, but young people want to take part in that as well, and sort of ask these questions.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So let me share some of the comments and questions that came in the chat, and they came. So I'm not going to mention the names because they weren't submitted. They were submitted to me privately. So with due apology to those who submitted the questions, I'm not going to share your names with everyone. I hope that's okay. One question. This is very interesting about the context. the actual political context in which the film is being viewed. So do you think that the answers that we get in the film would be different to the questions that you raised, would be different today, now that we actually have in Israel, as Udi mentioned, a coalition government that includes an Arab party? And related to that, how do you think the sentiment about the importance of the Jewish state in the context of the global resurgence of anti-Semitism would influence some of the reactions and the answers that we get in the movie? So two very important parts of the global and the Israel-specific context, political context. How do you think these two issues might shape some of the conversations in the film?
I will answer the first question. I realized that on the screenings that I participated in Tel Aviv, 2 screenings outside online, I felt that the fact that Benjamin Netanyahu is not prime minister anymore changed in a way the perspective about the film, because while we were filming, I think that Israel was really in deep, sorry, shit, really very deep shit. And although this government is in a way right-wing, but then have this Arab party within, something really changed in the atmosphere. We can be more optimistic. We have more hope now. So I think this is different now, a little. But still, the serious stuff has to be dealt with, which we expose in the film. So did I answer your first question?
Yes, it is your answer, Yulie. So that's there is no right or wrong answer. It's a very honest, open, and reflective answer to the question. So and I would like to thank you for that openness.
Yeah, the Arab party within the government gives me a lot of hope. Yeah, because as he said, Abbas said, I'm going to the market and I play the game. I mean, I include myself in the game. It's so finally it happens. And well, it didn't happen for 73 years. So this gives me a lot of hope. And regarding the second question, maybe Udi is better.
I can say, first of all, I agree with Yulie, and I also felt it that as soon as the government changed, the entire context of the film changed. I mean, you have to, the last couple of years in Israel, it was everything revolved around Bibi. It was not possible to have any conversation about Israel, about Israeli politics, about Israeli history, about anything within Israel without getting to that sort of elephant in the room, whether you like him or hate him, or but it had to come up. And I think that also when doing the interviews and when editing the film, we couldn't avoid it. We didn't directly speak about. I think somehow I'm happy about that we didn't directly speak about him in the film. We didn't ask them about Bibi personally. We didn't want to sort of discuss that situation. We wanted to go to the root questions, exactly to move away from party politics and personal politics and talk about the core issues themselves. But it was still in the room. And once he was ousted, and of course we need to remember he can come back in a minute, but as the moment the government changed, the entire context of living in Israel or discussing anything in Israel changed completely. We could somehow finally start to sort of restart the dialogue between ourselves about everything that we couldn't talk about. And it's not that everything is bright and perfect, but as Udi said, there's some hope, or there's some, at least it's not stagnation. There's a feeling of change. So I think that also sort of sheds a different light on the film and the questions that it brings up. And in a way, I think it was the film was late. It came out way later than we originally intended, but in a way, I think that it came out in the right time, just when sort of we can now deal again with these questions and not only with party politics and Bibi. And regarding the reaction, I think the reaction abroad is fascinating. Of course, most of the interest is the film also screened in non-Jewish festivals so far, but of course most of the interest is from Jewish festivals. Naturally, there's a strong link there, and I think, I mean, this could be a very long answer, so I'll try to keep it very short. But I think a lot of processes that went on in the last couple of years that have to do with Bibi and with Trump in the United States, and the things that American or Jews in the USA have experienced under Trump, and the fact that Trump and Bibi were allies, and that opened the whole question for American Jews about sort of always supporting Israel versus trying to look at the sort of make the separation between Jews, Zionism, the current Israeli government, and being able to deal with each of these issues in a different manner, which was not the case before, I think. A bunch of these things led to a situation where I think, so far we've met mainly Jews in the United States with this film, Jews in the United States, and I think for them, in a similar way, it's a good time to ask these questions, to go back to the origins and to rethink what Israel means, what it means to be a Jewish country. How does that collide with democracy? What prevails when there's a conflict there? So yeah, I think these questions resonate really well, I think, right now with especially with Jews, of course, around the world and in Israel.
Thank you, Udi. In the interest of time, let me package together the next three questions, and those will be the last batch that I'm going to be able to share with you, because I only asked for your time for only so long to make yourselves available, and you've been very, very gracious already. So the first question has to do with the location itself. Can you just please comment and say a few more words about the renovation, the physical rejigging of the building? What exactly is the nature of this process? Any information that you can tell us about what's happening to Independence Hall in Tel Aviv? A second question is about Mayor Vilner's grandchild. Do you know if the grandchild is perhaps also a communist today, and could that have anything to do with the attitude towards you and towards the idea of participating in the film? And the last question is about foundational values. So let me read this out. The American Bill of Rights and Constitution were based on the bedrock of the Hebrew Bible. I believe that the Israeli document is also based on Torah principles of Jewish sovereignty. Any comments, any thoughts? So the building, communism, and Torah values in Torah and Jewish values in the declaration.
Maybe I'll start from the end. It's funny. I didn't know that the American bill is based on principles from the Torah, because the Israeli declaration is based on the American one. So it seems like they've been basing them one off the other for some time now. But no, I mean, what I can comment on that is I remember a very heated debate that we read about and were told about when making this film, that has to do with how much God is mentioned even in the text, right up to the last moment. They had this huge debate whether to name God in the text or not. They eventually found a sort of middle ground where they say Sur Israel, which is, it could be interpreted as God, and it could be interpreted as just as the strength of the people and whatever. But it was definitely not definitively based on the Torah. I would say it's based, of course, on it mentions Jewish values, and it mentions the Jewish ethos, of course. But as I said before, there's always a tension there, because these were secular people drafting a document that is in part sort of lays on historical and religious sentiments, and that was always a tension from them as well. So they were not decisive about it. It was something that they sort of went between the drops when they had to come to it. And about the building, I can say something, and then I can leave the last one to someone else. The building is now undergoing renovations, very extensive renovation process. We were lucky enough to catch a part of it. What we actually caught was the moment where they lifted the entire building on this huge metal frame in order to change the foundation and then lay it back again because the foundation was not strong enough. It's quite a fascinating process to watch. It made the space seem, of course, even smaller and more modest than it even was when it was dressed. But basically, they're finally making it into a proper museum. So over the years, it was the Tel Aviv Museum where this thing happened to occur. The declaration, it was just a space that they have that was fitted, and then later it became the Museum of the Bible for a while, and it became neglected for a couple of years, and then they reopened it for an interim term in the state that we filmed it in, and now they're making a proper, international style kind of museum out of it with a big classrooms and places for schools and underground floors and basically building around the original building. So it should be quite a little bit more impressive place to visit in the next couple of years.
Great, thank you very much. And any final comments about communism and Mayor Vilner?
I mean, I just remember talking to him, so this one as well, but it was, as far as I remember, yes, he is, I can't say if he's a communist per se, but he definitely comes from the left side, from the far left side of the political map in Israel today, the grandson as well. There are only 2 grandchildren, and they were both shy. They said that they didn't want to sort of interview for a film on television. That was one part of it. And I think that they also had, from all the grandchildren, they are the ones who I think were the most estranged to the document itself and to the role that their grandfather played in establishing the country. And they didn't want to sort of represent that moment in his life from all the moments in his life. They admired many parts of his political achievements and career throughout the years, and a lot of his legislation and things that he done socially and otherwise. But being part of that document wasn't, a big source of pride for them. So they didn't want to be there representing that moment of all his moments.
Udi, thank you so much. And my heartfelt thanks to all 3 of you, Yulie, Udi, Sagi. You've been wonderful. You've been so open and honest, thought-provoking, intellectually teasing, every bit as exciting as the film was. And it wasn't an easy film for me, and I know for many people to watch. At particular junctures, I find myself banging on the table. I say, how can you say that? But that's okay. You made me react with as much passion as I have in terms of feelings and attachments to the document itself. But that's my story. Thank you again so much for making the film and for making the film come alive, even though we could only do it on the screen, still in a very meaningful and a fascinating manner. And I would also like to thank members of the audience in Montreal, in Europe, in Israel, for joining us in this wonderful, wonderful exchange. And last but certainly not least, I would like to thank Ms. Lisa Komlos, our social media and communications coordinator at the Azrieli Institute of Israel Studies, without whose able and effective work, none of this would have been realized. So Lisa, once again, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we look forward to welcoming you back at our next event. Our November newsletter has just been released. We'll have a series of additional documentaries to show you and to provoke you for additional exchange and conversation during November about the Israeli mosaic. And Udi, Yulie, and Sagi, when you make your next documentary, please consider us as a very natural and ready base for you to screen the movie in Montreal or in Canada. We always love hearing from you, and we look forward to welcoming you back. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this opportunity, for having us, for
Thank you.
showing the film. Pleasure to be back with you. Thank you.
Thank you.